Cool. Thank you, everyone, for coming and watching this talk. Welcome to SeaGL Day 2. I think this is one of the last talks of the day. Welcome to Scheduling Your Open Source Project with Ben Cotton. Ben is a senior program manager at Red Hat, working on Fedora and CentOS Stream. He is a long-term user and contributor to Floss projects and occasional Storm Chaser. So that sounded both cool and exciting at the end. So I'm really excited about this talk. I'm really excited to hear about all the solutions to my time management problems. And so take it away, Ben.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for being here, everyone. I'm assuming there are people here. I can only see my slides, not the audience. But I do want to cover some housekeeping that I normally would, even if I was up on stage in front of you. To wit, if you have constructive comments, I love to engage and interact with people on this. My Twitter handle is there, and it's on the bottom of every slide. You can email me at my Fedora email address or my personal email address. I'm on Freenode all the time. I basically live there. If you have unconstructive comments, you are, of course, welcome to keep those to yourself. This is under the Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike 4.0 license, so feel free to take it if it's helpful. Chop it up, redo whatever you want with it. Just, put my pretty face or name or something on it. And of course, opinions are mine, blah, 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 blah. So in the next 20 minutes, we're going to talk about, why you would even want to have a schedule, ways you can schedule, how you build that schedule out, some things that you can want to consider when you're doing it, and then what to do when your schedule is wrong. So why would you want to have a schedule, right? Like that seems so corporate and like that's not how open source projects work. Well, it turns out your users care when things are going to be released because, they might know that you're working on this cool new thing that they need for their project or for their use case, and they'd like to know when it's going to come out so they can, make use of it. Or they might want to know, hey, they're getting ready to have a release. I'll hold off on upgrading and just wait until I get to the next one. People have a variety of ways they consume software. If you have downstream projects, they also care because that's just essentially a different class of users, right? So if you're building an operating system in a community context and there is a company that takes that and builds an enterprise Linux distribution out of it and sells it for a bunch of money, they would like to know what's going on with your schedule. Now, your upstreams probably don't care, but you might care about your upstreams schedules, and you might care if their schedules fit yours. And you might care if they care, and you might want to convince them to care, right? So if you give them a reason to, your upstreams may actually care about your schedule. For example, Fedora, being a Linux distribution, has many hundreds or thousands of upstream projects that we basically integrate and put into a downloadable image for people to install on their machine. Some of those are, sort of big things that are throughout the Floss ecosystem, and some are just small little packages. But the big things, they want to have that user base and they want to, get out there. And they want to make it within a release so that they don't have to wait 6 more months. So recently, working with the Python upstream, some Fedora developers were able to get them to sort of commit to a predictable schedule that just happens to line up pretty well with Fedora's release schedule. And so even though we've just started work on Fedora 34, we already have a Fedora 35 change proposal accepted and ready to go once that development cycle begins. And that's going to be Python 3.10. The GNOME upstream, similarly, their release schedule matches up very well with Fedora's. And so, basically, there's about a month, I think, between the GA release of the GNOME desktop environment and the subsequent Fedora release that contains it. Obviously, this is only helpful, or this only works when you have schedules that can be understood by each other. And there's also sort of a philosophical question of how else will you know it's done? Because, it's never... Like software is never done. There's always more we're adding to it or bugs we're fixing. But like at some point, you do have to release it. And yeah, continuous release is a thing for a lot of things, but not for every project. And really what it all comes down to is the reason to have a schedule is communication, communication, and communication. Communicating with each other, with your users, with your upstreams, your downstreams, whoever. So there are some different ways you can schedule. And in the next slide, I'm going to talk about 3 ways that I've sort of thought about them in my mind. And in reality, nobody really strictly sticks to one of those. There is a little bit of a hybrid approach that I'll get into more. So don't take this as like very rigidly defined things, just sort of conceptual ideas. So there's a calendar-based schedule where you have a date on the calendar and say, this is going to be our release date. There's a feature-based schedule and you say, when we've reached this much feature, it's done. And then there's the, it's done, I guess, schedule. Now, I'll talk about the first 2 a lot more. The third one, I don't have a lot of input to offer because frankly, it's like you wake up and it's like, it's release day. And I'll talk about the pros and cons, again, mostly of the first 2, but there is no right answer here. This is what works for your project and for your community. And you may decide at some point that you're using one and you want to use the other, or you do a very weird mishmash of them and you sort of pick ideas from one or the other. And that's okay. This is very much a do what fits for you. So calendar-based schedules. Some of the nice things about them is they're predictable. February 30th is always going to be February 30th. Like, you know when that is. You know how far away that is. By and large, people already know how calendars work, even though my calendar says it's November 14th, and it's actually like the 260-something day of March right now, I think. But in the before times, people knew how calendars worked. And it makes it really easy to align with events. And I'll talk about events a little more in a moment. Of course, there are some downsides to calendar-based schedules in that they're fairly arbitrary. It's like, why did you pick this date? Because we like it. That doesn't really say anything about the state of your software or the development process or anything. And, there was a discussion about this in some of the earlier talks, but, contributors' availability varies. And not only in like the predictable ways where, generally the last week of December, Fedora sees a lot fewer contributions. Red Hat has a holiday shutdown. So people who are paid to work on Fedora are often doing less of that. And people who are volunteer contributors are often doing things like, spending time with family and relaxing and taking time off or flying off to the Bahamas or whatever it is people do. And it's not like 0 because some people are avoiding their family, or there was a long time when my kids were little when I had a consecutive streak of having Git commits on December 25th because they were taking naps after Christmas morning. And I was like, all right, what else am I going to do? But it also varies in ways you can't predict, because suddenly somebody will get really busy with work, or they'll get really busy with their family, or they'll get sick or whatever, and you can't necessarily plan for that. So if you're trying to stick to a calendar-based schedule, you might have some difficulty when life happens. On the other hand, feature-based schedules, they give you a lot more flexibility, and they kind of fit how a lot of, especially volunteer-driven projects work. Is, you have this list of things you're going to do, and whenever those get done, that's the release. Of course, that means they're a little unpredictable, because if I'm going to do, this new feature, and it takes me 6 months to do it, maybe a day of that was actual coding and development time, and the rest of the 6 months was just having 4 hours to sit down and bang it out. Who knows? And it can also encourage a little bit of what I call one more thing-ism, where, let's say you have a couple different groups or developers, and, you got these things that they're working on in parallel. One of them gets done and the other one's still going. He's like, all right, well, I'll go ahead and get started on this next thing. We'll include that. And then all of a sudden you're playing leapfrog with each other, and you're never actually finishing your development at the same time. And then there's the it's done, I guess, schedules. And that's a very YOLO development model. And that's okay too. There are a couple projects where I'm the sole developer, and I cut a release when I feel like it. It's like, all right, I actually have some time to work on this. I got the things done. Okay, it's a release now. Cool. So whatever your approach, you have to build the schedule. And to build a calendar-based schedule, it's like you might think, you start with your target release date and you work backwards. So you want to block out any known downtime. So if there's a conference that your entire contributor community is going to be at, if you know that most of your contributors are at a particular country where there's a multi-day holiday festival or something like that, the times that you know that people aren't going to be able to do work for whatever reason, and that could be there's another project in your ecosystem that you know is going to take all the attention for a couple of weeks. Plan for those to be non-work times. And then you want to estimate the time that each step is going to take. We'll talk about estimates a little bit more when it goes wrong. But generally, you can't be too conservative with your estimates. Then you want to think about the dependency relationships. So think about what can be done in parallel, what has to be done when the previous thing finishes. And once you have all those together, you've basically worked back to a date that is hopefully still in the future so you can begin the development process. So how do you pick that target release date in the first place? Well, you could base it on important dates for upstream or downstream project releases. It could be a tradition. We've always released on February 30th, and that's where we're going to keep doing. There might be conferences or events where you want to be able to get up on stage and deliver your keynote and say, hey, yesterday we just delivered feature XYZ, go download it. And so if it's not ready by that conference, that poses a little bit of a problem. You have fun days, especially like if you're in the Raspberry Pi ecosystem or Python. March 14th is Pi Day, and that's kind of a fun day to do it. On the other hand, you might intentionally avoid that day because there's going to be a deluge of other projects making announcements, and you'd like to go a little bit before or after so that you can get a little more of the attention. And you can also think about the amount of time it takes for the new release to be different enough. And that kind of, again, this is creeping into the feature-based schedule. But, you kind of, after you've done this a while, you start thinking, all right, well, realistically, every 6 months, we are able to do enough work that this sort of feels like it justifies a new release, or every 3 years, or every week. It depends on the scope of your project and your goals and all of that. So with the feature-based schedule, you're working forward. So you pick the feature set you want to do. Again, you block out your known downtimes, figure out how long each step's going to take, and add the dependencies. And then when you get there, you have a date in the future that you're sort of aiming at. But again, because you're doing it more based on the feature, you're not really aiming for that date, but that's just the approximation that you can give people. So how do you pick that feature set? Well, you got to think about, again, how different do you want it to be? Like what justifies a new release? Is it, you don't want to, do one typo fix in one menu item and say, this is a new release. People are going to be like, what? Huh? But also, you might want to break up the big changes if you can into smaller segments and roll those out over time, if the changes aren't too interdependent. If you're re-implementing the API and you only re-implement half of it, that could be really problematic for your users. So you want to make sure that it's a cohesive fit. Don't do things halfway and call it a release. And really, you can't avoid the calendar because at some point you do want it to be released. And there has to be some point where, gosh, we thought we'd get this done in 3 months and it's been 5 years and we're still not there. Maybe we should consider making some changes. And also just think about how much time you have available. If you know that your community can spend a grand total of 5 hours a week working on the project, don't try and pack too many features into this next release when you're building your schedule. Or you could just wake up in the morning and say, we're doing it. So some common considerations. You want to think about some milestones that you want to put on the schedule. Do you have deadlines for submitting changes, like proposing the change? For small projects, you probably don't. For large projects, that's really helpful as a communication tool, just so everyone knows kind of what's going on. You have deadlines for being code complete or documentation complete. Do you have merge windows? Do you have certain testing freezes? Do you want to do an alpha release or a beta release, or do you want to jump straight to your final release? Like, all of these things are milestones you might need to consider as you're building out your schedule. And again, it's going to be very dependent on what makes sense for your project. There are also conflicts. We talked about, conferences. That's a good time for people to not be able to get work done. And also a couple days before and after as they travel, back when that was a thing. There are related projects where, especially if it's a much larger or much more well-known project, people may have to divert their time to that for the time being. And so you might have a couple of weeks where they're all focused over here. Holidays are a thing that happen. Most of them are sort of geographically bound to some degree. So if your community is truly global, holidays may not impact you that much. But some things are fairly broadly observed. And then also just the fact that most projects aren't truly global. They tend to at least have some geographic centralization. And also the world all around us. If you haven't noticed, 2020 has been a bit of an ordeal for a lot of people. And most people just aren't able to get the amount of work done mentally that they'd hoped or wanted to. So you want to be considerate of that as you think about your schedule. And realize that if you change your schedule, a lot of your pieces are tied together with those dependency relationships. And so if you move one date forward or backwards to accommodate something, then you're changing everything else. So last summer, the Fedora release engineering team came to me and said, hey, can we move this, the start of this mass rebuild back? Because it always happens to overlap a couple of conferences. And I said, yes, we can. But the choices are shortening this, the development time period, or shortening the beta freeze and like the testing time period before the beta release. And after some discussion back and forth with different people, we kind of said, all right, it's fine where it is. We'll just, be a little flexible on when the window actually starts. So planning a few alternate scenarios can help. And then you also want to think about the perception. Marketing is a 4-letter word to a lot of open source projects, but it's really important, whether it's capital M marketing or lowercase m marketing. It's part of your schedule, whether you like it or not. Because if you put out a schedule and you stick to it, and you do that over time, you get credibility. And that's important, especially if you have companies who are wanting to pay you or participate in your ecosystem for their purposes. You have other projects that want to use your tool. They have to be able to trust you, and being able to release when you say you're going to is a big part of that. And realistically, not all 1-week slips are created equal. So in Fedora, we target the third Tuesday of April and October for releases, because if we slip a week, we go from our preferred target date to target date number 1. So if we do that in from the 3rd to the 4th Tuesday, we're still in April, we're still in October. It's fine. Like, we kind of plan for that anyway. It doesn't have that perception of being late. If you just move the date back 1 week, all of a sudden you slip from April into May, or you slip from October into November, and it's still the same 1 week slip, but all of a sudden it looks much different. Especially if you do your release names based on the year, month, or something like that, then it gets kind of confusing. And you just generally want to give yourself that flexibility and avoid the negative perception. So when your schedule is wrong, it's going to be, and that's okay, because you'll get less wrong with practice. And it's good to overestimate your overestimates. I had a professor in grad school who told me, take all your estimates and multiply them by 3, and they'll be less wrong. They're not right, they're just less wrong. You get better at it over time. So To fix wrongness on a calendar based, you can cut out some of the features that you plan to work on, or you can slip back your release date. For a feature based, you can cut troublesome features. If you're going with the Met, it's done, I guess, then your schedule is never wrong because it doesn't actually exist. And if you think you're being too pessimistic, you're lying. And I don't appreciate you lying to me like that. But you can release early, or you can add more stuff or do more testing, or you can just take a week and relax. Like, all right, we got this done ahead of time. That's awesome. I'm going to go have fun. And with that, I am at 20 minutes. And so it is time for the Q&A. If you have Qs, I have As.
How would you deal with trying to get buy-in from team members who might be resistant to having a schedule?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've given a talk before where I talk about the difference between program management in communities and in companies. And it turns out it's not that different in a lot of ways, because people still don't want to have to deal with it. They just want to go do their work. So the thing I found, that's really helpful is to make sure that when you're building up the schedule, you get the buy-in at schedule creation time from people, and make sure their voice is heard. So if you have some lead developers who are working on some of the large features, ask them how long it's going to be, and really emphasize the communication and the coordination aspects of it. And it's going to vary again between your different projects doing different kinds of work and different sizes. But you always have to, try and make the case that this is a valuable thing we're doing, and here's why, and it's going to help you. You specifically, the person I am talking to, will be helped by having this, because you'll know sort of what the shared expectations are.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds super reasonable. Another question was, what happens if you miss a release? You kind of talked about, if you slip a week, but maybe a feature gets stuck in development hell, or you miss a date. You kind of touched on this, but kind of what's your recourse for just fully missing a release?
I think at some point you come out and say, hey, we totally missed this, and we're just going to retarget what would have been the next release. One thing that was sort of implicit in my talk, which I didn't necessarily mean for it to be, is the idea that your releases have to be on a predictable cadence, every 6 months or every 4 months or whatever. I don't think that's true. I think there are a lot of cases where it does make sense to have that regular cadence, but for some projects it could be, this release is going to be a 3-month cycle, and this one's going to be 12, and this one's going to be 2 years, and then we'll go back to 3. But yeah, I would generally advocate having sort of contingency checkpoints where, if a feature is not at least a certain amount of the way done, well prior to the release, then you look at moving it to the next one anyway. And so, if you have a beta release planned and your stuff's not at least feature complete, even if it's not fully code complete, then okay, well, we're just going to skip that to the next one because we would like to stay on schedule. So, that's kind of the approach that I would generally take.
Cool. And then you also mentioned creating schedules. How public are these schedules? How detailed are they? And who tends to have write access to those? So
I would say you want varying levels of public schedule. So I could talk about Fedora specifically. We have sort of like a key tasks and milestones schedule that is then built up of schedules for the different teams. So the documentation team, release engineering, QA, things like that. But these are all fully publicly available. I'm the only one who has write access to them, just for a variety of reasons that I wish I could fix, but it's a little more difficult than it seems on the surface. You do want to sort of centralize some of the schedule control into a small group of people, I think. But, if you have different teams within your project, give them the autonomy to set their own schedules that feed up into the bigger ones. So, basically say, as long as you have this thing done by this date, whatever the actual specifics for your schedule are up to you. Because that's, really important part of the community ethos is that people are responsible and accountable for their own work.